Tom Quee presents The Royal Ramble, an episode-by-episode celebration of the classic British sitcom, The Royal Family. To get in touch with the show, email us at theroyalramble@gmail.com.
Hello everyone, it's Tom Quee here, back again with another edition of The Royal Ramble. I hope you're well, and I really do hope you've had your teas. So today is the beginning of a brand new series on the channel. This is more of prehistory to the Royal Ramble, really, to the Royal Family, as we are done with the Royal Family, as it were. I mean, it will always be with me, it will always be in my heart, of course, but we've tackled every episode. Not only that, but we've even tackled the charity specials as well that came out after and in between during the specials era. So yes, today is the first edition of a show that I've been long teasing. This is the first episode of Mrs. Merton Blurton, where we'll be blurting about Mrs. Merton, the Mrs. Merton Show. So we're going to be going through every episode of that classic spoof chat show, and it's going to be a little different to normal Raw Ramblers. This is going to be myself and a guest. Today is a solo episode, as I'm sort of establishing the context and the background, and we do have an interview as well, a very exciting interview as part of the episode to get to. But going forward, it's going to be myself and a guest talking about an episode of the Mrs. Merton Show, starting from the first episode and then going through all of the series. So I do have, up top, I just want to say, I do have a few guests booked in, but I want to get more and more booked in. So if you want to come on the show, if you want to talk to me about your history of the Royal Family, you know, your love of Carolyn Aherne, your love of Mrs. Merton, if you want to tackle a Mrs. Merton Show episode together, that's theroyalramblepod@gmail.com. Please get in touch with me, theroyalramblepod@gmail.com. Perhaps you've been on a quiz show in the past, or perhaps you've never been on the show, or whatever. That's theroyalramblepod@gmail.com. You know, we can talk about the show, we can talk about the 90s, we can talk about the guests, we can talk about everything. Yeah, all you need to do is rewatch the episode, make a few notes, and then just kind of put 20p in me, and I'll gabble on, I'm sure. Okay, so we've got lots to get to in this episode. As I say, this episode structurally, it's kind of a brief history of Carolyn Aherne. I then speak about her, well, Mrs. Merton's relationship, Carolyn's creative relationship with Frank Sidebottom, aka Chris Seavey. Also her work with Martin Kellner on the Night Network. That is my guest today as well. Martin Kellner was gracious enough to chat to me for 20 minutes or so about his work with Carolyn, and we'll get to that about in the middle of the episode. And then finally, I review the unaired pilot of the Mrs. Merton Show, back when it was spelled Murton. But just before we get to that, I just want to remind you to please tell a friend about the show. If you have a fellow Royal Family / Mrs. Merton obsessive in your ranks, let them know about this podcast. We also have the Patreon there, of course, as well. I want to give a big shout out to Fred Goff, who recently became a new patron. Thank you so much for supporting, Fred. And what do you get for supporting? Well, you get access primarily to the Grapes tapes. If you enjoy my thoughts on the Royal Family, and you've always wondered, what does Tom think of Early Doors? You know, the second masterpiece that Craig Cash and Phil Mealy were part of, the one set in the Grapes pub. Well, you're in luck, as 5 episodes are now out. I'm releasing them monthly, so I've been doing this for 5 months now. And yeah, I have done the first 5 episodes. I'm just writing my notes now for the Big Boys Beano, the classic episode that ends series 1. So yeah, if you want to hear that, you can go support over there. You get instant access. You get a link. You can just download it in the app. It's just how you listen to podcasts normally. It's very, very easy. And another thing we've been doing over here as well on the Patreon that is eventually going onto the free feed is the British Film Club, where I'm exploring with guests classics in the British film canon, gritty British. We've started off by looking at films that have Royal Family actors and actresses in. So the first one that I did with Jack was Hard Labour, Mike Leigh's incredible 1973 TV film that was where Liz Smith's star was born. But there is also now an episode on there on Dead Man's Shoes. There are no Royal Family people on Dead Man's Shoes, but it is a British classic, the Shane Meadows, Paddy Considine classic. So yeah, those are on there too, along with the Grapes tapes. If you want to support, you get access to all those and various other things early enough for people. And yeah, I'm looking for reviews on iTunes. I had a whole spate of them a few years ago, but now that I brought the show back, there are no reviews on there. So both for my ego and the fact that they do help with the algorithm, I want to ask, please leave a review, preferably 5-star, but we'll put something in there for you as well. We'll make it interesting for you. So if you leave a review in the next month or so, email me, therawramblepod@gmail.com. Show me proof that it's you that left the review, and I'll put you into a draw. And the winner of the draw will get access to the first series of the Grapes tapes for free. So that is 6 hours of my thoughts on Early Doors. And, I do what I do with the Royal Family with Early Doors. We have all the cultural references and, kind of reminiscences and stuff like that. And the deep line-by-line close reading analysis. So, yeah, if you leave us a review over on iTunes, you can get access to the Grapes tapes. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you just want to leave a review anyway, so please do that as well. We're on Spotify, we're on YouTube, we're on wherever your RSS feed takes you. Just search The Royal Ramble. And, yeah, it's very exciting to now be done, in a way, with the Royal Family and to be marching onto pastures new. And the Mrs. Merton show is, I've been watching all the episodes back now. I never actually kind of had this encyclopedic knowledge of it like I do with the Royal Family. And my God, what another masterpiece, really. The masterpiece before the masterpiece in Caroline and Craig and Henry Normal's case. So yeah, let's get into it with the first episode of Mrs. Merton Blurton.
So let's start with Carolyn. Carolyn Mary Ahern was born in Ealing, West London on the 24th of December 1963. Hey, that's just a day before baby David's birthday. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants, Bert, a labourer on the railways, and Maureen, a school dinner lady. Now that's interesting as well, isn't it? Because I'm pretty sure I need to rewatch that Royal Family documentary they did where they interviewed all the cast, kind of when the specials were around and they're on the sofa and watching the old clips and stuff. But I'm fairly sure that Karen Ahern says that Mary was inspired by her mother, or was a bit of her mother in Mary. So, yeah, the fact that she's a school dinner lady kind of stood out to me there. And by the time Carolyn was free, her father moved the family to live in the Wythenshawe district of Manchester. Now, this is a line that we'll later hear Jim say, although I know dads just say this all over, but I thought this was quite interesting when I was doing a bit of research on the history. This is from Carolyn, quote, "My dad was always going on about the immersion and about lights being left on. It's like fecking Blackpool illuminations," he used to say. Now, sadly, Carolyn battled ill health from an early age. This was both her and her brother, Patrick. They were born with a rare cancer of the retina. And when she was 4, the local Catholic Church raised money to send the 2 children to Lourdes. However, her mother, Maureen, decided to put her faith in St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London and took Carolyn and her brother there for regular treatment. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, however, she spent the rest of her life with partial sight in one eye. Regardless of this unfortunate start, however, Carolyn swiftly developed the role of family joker and gained an ability to accurately mimic characters on TV. These include characters like Margot and Barbara from The Good Life, and celebrities such as Marty Kane and Cilla Black. Nobody else in the family was like that, this is her brother speaking, but she was funny from the time she was very little. And by the time that Carolyn was 15, she had taken a decision to become a writer after seeing the Mike Leigh play Abigail's Party on BBC TV. And, that's very telling, isn't it? Because the royal family is incredibly Mike Leigh-ish, And Carolyn, unsurprisingly, was incredibly bright. She apparently achieved 9 grade A O-levels at a local convent school before going on to study drama at Liverpool Polytechnic. And her IQ was actually measured at a stratospheric 176, supposedly higher than the scientist Stephen Hawking, which, it doesn't really surprise me. Like, the more I watch Mrs. Merton, the more I watch Royal Family, the more I listen to interviews with this woman. Like, she was a kind of phenomenon, really, that kind of just straddled 90s culture like no one else. What a legend Carolyn is. She studied drama at Liverpool Polytechnic and was a secretary at BBC Manchester. Her desire to be a researcher failed, however, here because she was, quote, too giddy in the job interviews. One of her first jobs with the BBC in Manchester was secretary to Janet Street Porter, but the performance bug at that point was already ingrained in her. She became here a regular on the Manchester comedy circuit in the character of Mitzi Goldberg, a spoof country and western singer. And also the nun Sister Mary Immaculate was another early creation from this time. And what about Mrs. Merton? Well, there's a lot of kind of contradicting stories here. So I've pieced all this episode together, from a lot of videos and Wikipedia and certain books as well, and there's some good articles online. So I'm fairly certain that Carolyn developed Mrs. Merton with Henry Normal, who obviously would go on to write The Royal Family. He was a performance poet in Manchester at the time, and with Craig Cash as well, whom, she presented a show on KFM, a Manchester radio station. Dave Gorman also involved. But there's also stuff about Frank Sidebottom maybe being involved. But, I'll try and kind of make as much sense of this as we can. So yeah, Mrs. Merton, as I said, was developed in collaboration with Henry Normal. And, how to describe Mrs. Merton? She went through many different transformations as she went on, but ultimately she's an elderly agony aunt, who's very, very convincing, and the way Carolyn plays her, it's leaning into that kind of Norma archetype, isn't it? The kind of every man, every nan, if you will, kind of thing, And it goes without saying to say that she played the character to perfection. So Carolyn had this character, but, how did the character get out into the wider world? Well, there was a fantastic article, a great article from the Yorkshire Post. This is by Martin Kellner. And I'm just going to quote from this liberally because it's very, very interesting about the origins of Mrs. Merton. Quote, this is from Martin. "The first time I met Carolyn Ahern was the day she walked into the BBC radio studios on Oxford Road in Manchester, where I was doing a Saturday evening show. She had brought with her a tape called Mrs. Merton's Choice. It was basically her being a standard Radio 2 presenter of the time, when the station had a reputation for being rather staid. The first song she played on it was by Eddie Calvert, who was known as the man with the golden trumpet. At the end she said, 'That's Eddie Calvert there. He's dead at the moment.' I thought it was absolutely hilarious, but a bit too close to home. So instead, we invited her to do the character as an elderly agony aunt, answering people's problems. This was in the 1980s, and at the time I was doing a Radio 2 show as well as presenting a late-night show from Radio Leeds Studios, which went out across the BBC Night Network in the north. Carolyn was a regular guest on the show, and we had lots of fun ad-libbing together. We ended up doing it for 6 or 7 years. And yeah, there are actually some clips of this on YouTube, which I couldn't believe because I just figured this would be lost to the ether, but there are quite a few clips. So why don't we hear a bit here? Here's Carolyn as Mrs. Merton giving some advice like only she can.
But it still doesn't solve Simon Peacock's problem.
No, because he's still got the short curtains.
And a lot of people in Hull have
yes.
got the short curtains. What do you do? I've thought long and hard, because of course, even though he's a student, he won't want people to be peeking at him while he's undressing, because of course, with the nets being too short, they could see anything near the window vicinity. So I was thinking, have you seen those fairy things that you get to the bottom of your door to keep out the draft?
Draft excluders?
Yes, he could put one of those along, you see, and it would be ample to cover the little bit that he needs covering.
He could do that, couldn't he?
He could do that, yes.
Because you don't know how big the gap is. I mean, it might be bigger than that.
He hasn't put inches.
Dimension. He's not put a dimension.
No, he hasn't. So I'm assuming we're talking 2-3 inches. So if he could maybe, and those are quite furry and quite big, some of them, aren't they? So if he could put one of those there, or books, because I'm assuming he'll have some books as a student.
Yes.
I don't normally like students, as you know, but he seems a very, very nice one, and he's written on 100% recycled paper.
Has he?
Which is a very modern environmental thing to do.
And here is my interview with the great Martin Kellner. So yes, it's great to be joined now by someone who has been broadcasting on national radio for over 4 decades. He is a writer, a journalist, a comedian, an author. He's written 2 fantastic books. And he worked extensively with Mrs. Merton, with Carolyn Ahern. Martin Kellner, how are you?
I'm absolutely fine, yes, and thank you for the very generous intro. But it is 4 decades, ridiculous, but there you go.
It's insane, really, looking through your history, and it's primarily BBC that you've worked on and various other stations. At the time that you're meeting Caroline, you're part of something called the BBC Night Network. Can you sort of explain what that was? 'Cause I was reading into this. It was like a big thing back in the day, wasn't it? Quite a big jump.
It was, yeah. It was, well, it was local radio, basically. But it was, I suppose, to some extent, it was cheaper to run lots of local radio stations together. And you put, because it was at night, you put a lot of general stuff into it. So it didn't have to be hyper local. So it made sense. And because I was based in the north of England and I was doing it at one stage, we were doing it for about 14 stations, which is ridiculous, really. Well, it was just one of these BBC discs. I think they're doing it again now. They sort of join up at night time or in the afternoon, that sort of thing. So it was just BBC stuff. It's always happening. They do it for a while, then they stop doing it, and they do it again, and
And you met Carolyn in the 80s, right? How did you actually meet her?
Well, I used to show for Radio 2. I was on Radio 2 on a Saturday night, produced by a variety of different people, but at one stage produced by Mark Radcliffe. Now, Mark, who you'll know of, he was at Radio 1 and et cetera, et cetera. But at that time, he was a producer within the BBC. and we did our show from out of Oxford Road in Manchester. I think that's all gone now,
Yeah.
but we did it from there. And Mark was sort of almost he was almost surgically attached to Frank Sidebottom, who's
Yeah,
sadly
yes,
no
he was
longer
part of the
with
band,
us.
wasn't he, at a time?
Yes, yes, he
Mm.
did. He played drums. So Chris Seavey, alias Frank Sidebottom, was
Genius,
a
yeah.
genius. Was on virtually every show that Mark ever produced.
Right.
Mine being one of them. So we would do various things. I mean, it was hilarious, but we'd do various things with Chris
Yeah.
and run them in my show. And one of the tech ops, one of the studio assistants, said to me, I hear you running that Frank Sidebottom stuff. My girlfriend does a funny character. Would you be interested in running her? This was Radio 2, so it's big stuff. It was
Mm-mm.
network stuff we started with.
Yeah.
And I said, well, give me the tape. So it was a reel-to-reel tape. Some of your teenage audience won't know what the hell I'm talking about, but it was a reel-to-reel tape that record a home recording of her doing a show called something like Mrs. Merton's Favourites. I can't remember.
Mm.
I had the tape for a long time. I can't find it now,
Wow.
unfortunately. Although there are bits of it that I've probably got on
Yeah.
on my iTunes thing. But yeah. Anyway, so he gave me the tape. And on the tape, it was the problem with it was, and I said this to the guy and also to Caroline. The problem was it sounded like a spoof of a Radio 2 show. I said I
Right.
can't really run it because it's
Yeah,
actually
yeah, yeah.
taking the piss out of Radio 2, or certainly Radio 2 as it was at the time.
Uh,
She was playing, said, "Oh, that's a tune from Eddie Calvert. He's dead at the moment," and she would do these sort of these lines in it, which
yeah.
were very funny. But I thought we could, if we introduced her as a character on the show, it would work better. So we did that, and we had this spot which we ran for ages and ages called "Mrs. Merton Can Help You,"
Mm.
which was basically we invented most. I mean, we did get one or two genuine ones, but we mostly invented letters that had supposedly come from listeners with a problem, and Mrs. Merton would talk through it and invariably make me scream with laughter. It's just unbelievable, great stuff.
So this is kind of our first proper extended exposure to Mrs. Merton, and like you say, yeah, it's you and her going through letters that have been sent in and problems and whatnot, and kind of
Yeah,
going back
yeah.
and forth. Like what was sort of determined beforehand, because it has a very improvisational feel, and one of the things that I like is you are kind of the straight man, but you'll also kind of, of the clips that are on YouTube, I should say, there's not too many available that I've been able to listen to, but you have a really nice back and forth.
Yes, and yeah, I'm totally the straight man because you couldn't be anything else with Caroline.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm totally the straight man. But as you say, you throw in the odd. It's even in Morecambe and Wise. Ernie Wise threw in the odd bit. There's the odd bit that was
Hmm.
about him. But yeah, it was. I would say it was about probably 40-50% improvised.
Hmm.
So the rest of it, we would talk beforehand about what we're going to talk about, which sometimes from me, sometimes it was her, and we'd come up with an idea. But occasionally she would just come up with something that we hadn't even discussed. There was no, I
Right.
didn't know it was going to happen. That was
Yeah.
usually when we had to do a retake because I was laughing too much.
And what time of the evening was this happening? Because I mean, you say, I mean, I'm doing a bit of research. You've been going for like 8 years or so. So was this like just an established spot, or was it like random? Or
Yeah, it was an established spot.
mm,
I mean, we ran it. We ran it regularly on BBC Local Radio, BBC Two, and on the original Radio Five. We ran it on that
yes,
as well. And I think Mark produced some of those shows too. So I would sort of negotiate with her when we were going to do it. I mean, in the early stages, we started the whole thing so that she wasn't doing anything else particularly
mm,
much, apart from her job, which was at the BBC,
yeah,
which is sort of why you know how it all came about, that she met someone from the BBC, and she was working on things like Question of Sport and other BBC shows that came from Manchester in a
Mm.
sort of secretarial role. So we do, but then later she went to Signal Radio in Stockport. Don't know whether you've got that on your
Yeah, there's a
yeah,
few here. The thing is, Martin, there's so many like she was on this show, she did this, and it's just like
yeah.
you can't listen to it. I'm just dying to hear this stuff.
Yeah, well, I've got lots of stuff,
Oh, okay.
which I can send you some other
Yeah,
stuff
it'd be
that
great to hear
you may
that.
not
No,
have
it'd be
heard.
amazing.
Some of it I think may have been on some of it may be on YouTube,
Mm.
but I've got a lot of stuff that's not on YouTube, and I mean the quality is not great because most of the stuff I have got, I mean I didn't realise nobody does it. It was going to, you know, it was just a funny spot on the show.
Well, yeah.
I didn't realise it was going to be absolutely huge and people would still be interested 40 years, well, not quite 40 years, but certainly 30 odd years later. So you didn't realise it at the time, didn't keep
No.
much stuff. But what's happened since is that people have sent me, there are people who recorded it. We would do it, say, at if I was doing a show like a late show on BBC Local Radio on the
Mm.
night network, I would have a regular spot for it, like at 10:30, 11 o'clock,
Sure.
whatever it was. And there were people who switched on the, you know, recorder and recorded it on cassette, which is why you know, the quality is not great. But
No.
then, you know, in later years, they've sent me copies of it.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like people who recorded the Beatles back at Walton Fate or whatever,
Yeah.
So it's like it's one of those things for me.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the recordings as well, and one of the recordings that's available on YouTube, there's literally like maybe like 30, 40 minutes of recordings across 3 to 4. So there obviously isn't much.
Yeah.
But Craig Cash, her nephew Craig is actually in this one, which I found fascinating. I mean, did he come in often, or was that a one-off? Or
No, Craig, I used to go out again with a reel to reel and go to Craig's home at Marple
Mm.
and would record Craig. He used to do little drop-ins for the show in which he pretended to be well-known American personalities, but obviously didn't do any accent. He did it in the Craig Cash voice. So he'd do things like, oh yeah, one he did for me was, hello, I'm Benny from ABBA. Yes, and I'm Bjorn from ABBA. And whenever I'm in Leeds, I'm listening to Martin Kellner or something like that. So he used to load, I've got a load of those Craig sort of name checks. But I started with Caroline, and
Mm.
then you know Craig sort of came in later on after she was at Signal, I think in Stockport.
And what about like the renown of Mrs. Merton? Because like you say, it was 8 years she was coming on the show, and this is prior to the TV show. Like, did you feel she was a known entity? Were people mentioning her to you, or
To an extent, you know, not greatly
no?
because it, you know, whatever
Yeah,
you say
yeah,
about
just not. Yeah,
it was BBC Local
there was
Radio.
no iPlayer back then. No one
There
could
was no,
revisit it.
no,
So.
you could precisely, and there was no Twitter, and there was none
No.
of that. You
Mm.
know, when you're doing it now, and it was something as good as it was, because it was, you know, people who liked it, and there was a small cognoscenti, if you like, who
Yeah.
would write to me on a regular basis, and in those days, it was literally writing you a letter
Yeah.
to say how much they do. So you couldn't sort of casually say, oh, "Have you heard this? It's brilliant," and put it on
Mm.
Twitter or you know X or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, somebody would write to you, and there was a collection of people who really enjoyed it, and we did a live show. We went out and did something we called a night of fabulousness and she did two characters. She did Mitzi Goldberg, which was another character she did in the
Hmm.
early days, and Mrs. Merton, and we did it live on stage from the Arts Centre in New York. And it was a full, you know, 2 hour show that we did with a band and all sorts. So we did, you know, promoters, and we did a thing from Meadowhall in Sheffield. We went out and you'll know about the TV recording that we did,
Yes. Yeah. Of course.
presume, which because
Yes.
I
Yes.
think
So
that's
this is
on
you
YouTube.
sort of helped to finagle the original Yorkshire pilot. Is that right?
Yes,
Mm.
I did that, and we recorded. I just got sort of mates in basically. Andy and Liz Kershaw, who I knew very well,
Yes.
and Chris and Simon Donald, who I knew very well as well, from Viz. So
Hmm.
they were the victims, they were the guests. But I think that footage is now on YouTube, is it?
It is available, yeah. So this is the unaired pilot that
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
part of as well. And you mentioned this in your book, actually, When Will I Be Famous, which is an excellent book about sort of
Oh,
the
bless you.
margins of celebrity. No, it's a great read. And yeah, you speak about Carolyn being paid £15 a month,
That's right.
a
A
week,
week,
excuse me, to
50,
do an
yes.
improvised comedy bit. So you say here as well, this is just a quote. We
Started
tried
at 10, by the way, but I managed to argue them up to 15.
You
15.
say we tried in a fairly half-assed way to interest various TV companies in the project without success, and then eventually Caroline gave it to someone in Granada TV. And I mean, was this something that you would have been interested in if it did get picked up? That you would work on this, or?
Yeah,
Mm,
obviously. But eventually she had other people sort of working on it. So it wasn't a huge, at the time. You just thought, great, because she got about the same time. I think she got the Fast Show,
yeah,
and I remember her saying to me, "I'm doing this show, which sounds to me like," she said, "it's absolute bloody rubbish." She said, "It's just complete shit, this show." And she said, "There's some girl in it, she's dead posh, and she says, 'Does my bum look big in this?' And there's a,
right.
and she said it was rubbish. So imagine my surprise when it turned out to be so brilliant.
Oh yes,
But
indeed.
yeah, so at the time it wasn't a big issue, and I think at that time I was doing Radio 2 down in London.
Mm,
So by the time but we were still recording Mrs. Mertens even when she was working out of Granada with Dave Gorman
yeah, Henry Normal.
and Henry Normal. That's right.
Yeah.
Because they came on the show once or twice,
Okay, that's
when
interesting.
I was doing the show from Manchester. But yeah, so it sort of didn't arise when it was picked up. It was just, oh, great, it's been picked up really.
And what was it like, witnessing, like, okay, work with Chris Seavey and obviously work with you extensively, and then suddenly everyone knows who Mrs. Merton is, and the show was massive, right?
Yeah, well, again, not originally, I don't think,
Yeah.
because it was a Granada. I mean, initially it was a couple of spots with Tony Wilson, the late
Mm,
great Tony Wilson, on late night on a Friday, I think, on Granada. So it wasn't that sudden.
mm.
I tell you, it became sudden. I think probably now you'll know better than me because you're more of an anorak in this area than
Yeah.
I am. But whenever it was, she talked to, she did the Paul Daniels line about the
Yeah,
movie
yeah, that
record.
was the kind
That's
of
when it became famous, wasn't it?
yes.
And he licked you in the ring and all those lines that
Yes.
she did. So I think it became famous. Would that be the first or the second
That was the first series. Yeah,
First
that was the
series, yeah.
first.
That's when it kicked off, really.
Did
But there was lots of stuff before that because she was on a thing called the Saturday Zoo. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
she was also on Frank Sidebottom's Fantastic
It was
Shed
a shed
show as
show,
well.
yeah. Well,
So yeah.
see, and a friend of mine produced that, Dave Behrens, and
Mm.
he together with we stole the studio time from Yorkshire TV for that unaired pilot, which Dave and me produced together, and then later did the shed show.
Oh yeah, I love the Shed Show as well. I think that is
Yes.
like a lost classic of British TV that
It
no
is,
one
isn't
seems to know
it?
about. Like it's all on YouTube in it. But did you stay in touch with Caroline? Did you get a chance to go to any of the tapings or?
No, I sort of stayed in touch
Mm,
on a sort of email, occasional phone call basis,
mm.
but she did become, as you say, sort of cosmic at
Yeah,
that
well,
point.
yeah.
And I always find when somebody becomes huge. I mean, in this scenario, I'm a bit of a Broadway Danny Rose figure, if
Mm,
you know the Woody Allen film,
yes.
because you sort of people, get their agents, and she went with Phil McIntyre, I think, at that point, and
Hmm.
the agents will handle everything. And however close you've been to somebody at the start of their career, it doesn't really matter. You still have to go through agents, etc.,
Yes.
etc. And so that was a matter of some regret, but not,
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
not terminal.
And then of course the royal family takes things up a notch even further,
Uh,
like an iconic, truly iconic show. Obviously, I'm biased, but like any memories of that? Like, again, this must have been kind of wild for you just to see, oh, wow, she's in this giant comedy drama that people saying is one of the greatest of all time.
Yes, well, absolutely. I
Mm,
think I was probably um, more sort of startled by, well, not so much startled, but more admiring of Craig Cash,
mm,
because
mm.
Craig never struck. He was on my show quite a lot,
Yeah.
but I never thought of Craig as a huge, as a comic performer.
Hmm.
I always saw Craig as a sort of, a sidekick type character, but he was brilliant in that as well. And Jim Royal,
Oh, of course. Ricky.
yeah, Ricky Tomlinson,
Hmm.
who I met in Benidorm. I think I might have put it in my book actually,
Mm,
in my first book.
yes.
But yeah, there were, and so it was fantastic. So, well, I don't know. I'm talking to you about it, Phil.
Yeah, I'm
It's
quite a
your
fan.
podcast. You're a fan, obviously.
I'm
Oh,
quite, I'm more than a fan. I think, I'm doing a
yeah.
podcast about it, but yeah, no, that's great. And then any other sort of interactions? Obviously, we lost Caroline tragically early, but I
Yeah.
appreciate what you're saying about the agents and stuff. But that was it more of a kind of back in the day thing, or
Yeah, it was more of
mm,
a back in the day thing, and the one thing I'm proud of, when she was going through, and then obviously, as we know how it ended tragically,
mm,
I was approached by tabloid papers from time to time, and I'm quite proud of the fact that you're the first person I did a thing for the Yorkshire Post
yeah,
sort of years and years later,
hmm,
but at the time, managed to not to speak to any of the tabloids because they did ring, and
yes,
well, they want stories all the time, and you never know how they're going to be interpreted. So no, I would say from I think about the time I was still in touch with her when she got married to Peter Hook,
okay,
that time,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
from then onwards, not really much. But
Okay. Well, I mean,
yeah.
yeah, the time you did spend together is
So
is amazing, like we say, and like it's wild to me. Like I don't know, doing this initial research, I was like, oh yeah, she did that for 6 months, but it's like 8 years you guys were
yes, we
doing this
did
for.
a
It's a
long
long
time.
time.
Yeah, yeah. It was a long time. It didn't feel like it. Yeah,
No,
it was just
no,
something you did on the radio.
indeed.
That and there are people who were there in the early days of also, because you build a character over the years,
Mm,
and
mm.
it did. 8 years does seem a long time. Didn't seem a long time while we were doing it.
No, no, and it'd be fascinating because Mrs. Merton has quite a lineage and quite a history. Like when you watch the Mrs. Merton show, there's lots of references to things that come back. So
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what got unearthed in your recordings and whatever I can hear. But yeah, no, Martin, this has been a treat, and I just want to end by saying that I'm just going to show it. I'm showing it on camera, dear listeners. Sit down and cheer.
Oh, bless
Uh,
you. I
I
don't.
have loved reading this book. This is a
Have you?
fantastic book.
Oh, bless you.
Because obviously you only agreed to arrange to have you on recently, and I was going through and I saw that you've written a few books, whatever. But yes, it's a history of sport on TV, and like, I don't know, I am an anorak, as you rightly diagnosed earlier, and like to
Did I
talk about.
say that? Did I call you an anorak?
I always said with love, I'm sure, but like the minutia that you get into, like I had genuinely always wondered, like on the day of the World Cup final 1966, what was on TV, what did they actually do? And you were like, there was barely anything on it. And like
No.
what's great is you remember it as well. So it's not even
Yes.
it's like firsthand. So I just want to urge people again to read this book. It's
Well,
amazing.
bless you. Although it does me no good whatsoever. I get no royalties from that. They now, I think it's a thing that Amazon do.
Mm.
They print it by demand. But I have got a more recent book out
Ah,
called Wrestling in Honey. And when I say more recent book, it's a sort of greatest hits collection. I wrote that column for The Guardian for years and
yes, of course,
years.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's a sort of collection of some of those and some other bits and pieces. So, and I'm going to do some of them on Substack possibly as
Yeah,
well,
it's a good idea.
which
That's a good
is
idea.
a new one. If I can work out how it works. I mean, it's new to me, Substack. Are you on Substack?
Oh, I'm not. No, I follow a few people on there. And yeah,
Right.
it is a fantastic fit. And you had a podcast for many years, right? The Piss Poor
The Piss
podcast.
Poor podcast,
Yes.
yes, of blessed memory. Had that, I was too early with that. That's
Yeah,
my fate.
2006 you were doing that. It's incredible.
I know it's my fate to miss which was Frank's fate in Chris's fate in many
Indeed,
ways.
indeed.
He before Vic and Bob were doing the surreal nonsense on the
Hmm.
TV. Vic Reeves and Bob
Oh yeah,
Mortimer,
yeah,
massive. He was doing something similar, Again, he was just a bit ahead of the curve. You want to be on the curve, not ahead of the curve. And we were way ahead with our podcast, way ahead. But there you are. There you are.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned Chris Stevie as well. The band that he had before Frank Sidebottom, the
Yeah, the
Freshies.
Freshies, yeah.
They are like criminally under listened to. They're like you go on Spotify, they have like 100 monthly listens or something, and they're brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant songwriting. But as is the way. But I guess, is there anything finally for yourself that you'd like to promote, or how do people follow you?
Well, people can follow me on I'm on X at Martin Kellner, I think it is. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm
Yes.
on Facebook. But I do have a book out. Is this in Vision or is this
This will, yeah, it will be, yeah, it will be.
will be? In that case, hold on a second.
Yes, please go ahead.
This is my current book, which is a collection of stuff, basically. It's probably overpriced for what it is, but well worth getting hold of if if you've got nothing better to do and you're a person of independent means. But it's it's much, and I do still get slight royalties from this. I think I earned
Okay, we
about-
want to push people towards this one. This is the main one.
There you go. Sit down and share. Nothing. Sit down and
Yeah.
share is long gone.
So, Martin, thank you so much again for your time. This has been great.
No worries. No worries. Thank you. Cheers.
Hey everyone, just a quick intermission to remind you that The Grapes Tapes is now available exclusively on Patreon. This is my deep dive into the classic sitcom Early Doors, written by and starring Craig Cash and Phil Mealy. So if you're enjoying the Raw Ramble and you want to hear my thoughts on that classic show Early Doors, check out The Grapes Tapes. Link in the description. And it was roughly around this time, this era, that Carolyn started working with Chris Seavey, aka Frank Sidebottom. And I must say, it's so weird. I've been aware of Frank Sidebottom for a while. I was just coming out of uni when the film Frank came out with Michael Fassbender, which I still need to see, which is kind of, inspired by John Ronson's time, but not really a biopic and stuff. So I knew the head, I knew the anarchy, I knew what he looked like. I didn't really know what he was about. And it was only doing this and reading more and more about Carolyn's early life, because I never knew that Frank Sidebottom was a huge part of Mrs. Merton's lore and supposedly maybe even invented her. And that led me to getting into Frank Sidebottom, who I can confidently say now I'm completely obsessed with. I've watched Being Frank twice, the documentary. I've got 2 books on Frank Sidebottom, one of which I'm about to quote from liberally. I've been watching all of The Shed Show on YouTube, any clips I can find on YouTube, listening to so much of his music, listening to The Freshies as well, which was Chris Sivvy's band before Frank Sidebottom. And I just think he's a singular genius. I think he's absolutely like a mental phenomenon, really, and someone that maybe in the future, I don't know what we're going to do after this, but maybe I'll do a Frank Sidebottom podcast. I mean, I know I need to do Mrs. Merton and Malcolm and Early Doors and stuff like that, and maybe even Rover. So there's a lot on my plate. But yeah, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say, before we get into the history of Carolyn and Chris Seavey and, aka Frank, that Frank is an utter genius. And if you even have a passing interest in Frank Sidebottom, I mean, I've not really even described who he is, but it's kind of like, he's, so it's Chris Seavey wearing this big Reuben Fleischer head, kind of Betty Boop adjacent kind of thing. And yeah, he's got a nose peg on and he's completely manic and he's just this kind of anarchic man-child with an unbelievable capacity for, physical comedy, but musical ability and just a kind of satirical deconstruction and celebration of a slightly infantile outlook on the world. And he has to be heard to be believed, really, and seen to be believed. And Carolyn was there with him. So Chris Seavey and Carolyn, how did that come about? So I'm now going to quote a few passages from an absolutely incredible book that I highly recommend you pick up. It's by a guy called Mick Middles, who actually knew Frank Sidebottom back in the day, and the book is called Frank Sidebottom Out of His Head. And as a history of Frank, it's absolutely fascinating, but there are quite a few Carolyn Aherne sections, such as this section, and I'm quoting someone that Mick quotes that worked with him at Piccadilly Radio, and this is when Chris was coming up with a new idea for the radio station. Quote, Chris had many ideas, but one that got through was the invention of a new character called Andy Wright. Wright would be a failed Manchester musician and obsessive who had been given a Sunday morning show. Musically, he would play a bit of new wave, punk, guitar-y stuff really, and he would be a bit mopey. It started off quite straight, but as the weeks went by, things would start to get increasingly odd and surreal. Things like, well, he would have to bring his kids into the studio while he did the show because he couldn't get a babysitter, and they would start interrupting him during his links. Or his wife would call up and start telling him off. Or he would have a row with his producer, me, and I would storm out and he wouldn't be able to work the equipment. As the weeks progressed, it would get stranger and stranger. The idea was that no one would know it was Chris at all, and there would be no connection to Frank. I think we must have been on air for about 6 months and absolutely no one had cottoned on that it was him. Paula and the kids, Paula being his wife, Paula and the kids came in a few times to do a few bits, and Carolyn Ahern came in and played his randy neighbour. This would have been about 1988 to 1989. It was a strange interlude in his Frank adventures, and many aspects of it were Chris sending up his own life as a musician as well. So yeah, I just think it's wild that Carolyn was in Chris's orbit, and it was such a kind of melting pot really of talent back then when you think about it. And this is actually mentioned in the book by Middles himself, who again is quoting someone close to Chris, saying, quote, "I think it's endlessly fascinating to note just how many people around Chris went on to do really well. Obviously people like Mark Radcliffe, Mark Riley, Chris Evans, Carolyn Ahern and John Ronson. It's a long list and sometimes unlikely." So that was Caroline with Chris, but how about Mrs. Merton and Frank Sidebottom? Well, again, this is from the book, speaking about Caroline, Chris's wife Paula and Chris himself meeting for a drink. Quote, "However, this evening was to play a part in the story of Chris Seavey and indeed the dark and mysterious twists of fate that happened around him, around Frank. And it was Chris, rather than Frank, who attended this strangely low-key evening. He was in good and mild humour too, sipping pints of bitter, though not copious amounts, and accompanied by a witty, talkative Paula and her nervous companion, Carolyn Ahern. The significance of the moment couldn't possibly be apparent to anyone, and yet it was an oddly reflective affair, as if something was about to change, something beyond the inception of a new local radio station." This being KFM, by the way, he's making reference to. Carolyn was a funny girl, obviously so, although not particularly on this occasion. She had certainly impressed station manager Steve Toon, who after one meeting offered her the lofty role as co-presenter of the new station's breakfast show. Her counterpart in what would become a joyous, frenetic stomp around the retail establishments of Stockport Town Centre would be Heaton Moor painter and decorator Craig Cash, who had presented occasional shows at the pirate KFM's home in Goyt Mill, Marple. We all knew Craig well, this is Middles talking. Natural, witty, precocious and wholly unpretentious. Toon had known him for years and his appointment seemed to make perfect sense, even if some of the housewives of Adswood struggled to grasp his vivid sarcasm. What we didn't know at the time, and what Chris couldn't possibly have known, is that they were beginning a journey that would carry them to BAFTA-winning success and, flanked by the likes of Henry Normal, emerge as one of the true cornerstones of British comedy. The very idea would have seemed absurd. So yeah, at this point, Carolyn as Merton was working with Frank Sidebottom as well, and Seavey indeed, Chris Seavey, asked her to voice the part of Merton on his album, 5988, released in 1988. And this is an incredible album, really, in general. You know, if you're familiar with Frank Sidebottom, it's a lot of kind of hacky but spirited, full of heart covers, spoken word interludes, really kind of ahead of its time production techniques as well, very Goon Show-like in some ways as well. And Carolyn Ahern is on the record. And probably the most famous point, there's like 3 of them. There's 2 on the main album, and then on his MP3 collection on Spotify, there's a 3rd one as well. But yeah, the main one is called Mrs. Merton's Baby, where little Frank, who is obviously Frank Sidebottom's puppet, and the idea of a man with a head whose lips you can't see move using a ventriloquist puppet is just too delicious, too brilliant still. But yeah, so essentially, you know, it's very morbid in a way, in that little Frank, this puppet, is given a baby to take care of, Mrs. Merton's baby, and yeah, the baby is killed essentially, and lots of terrible things happen to the baby, and Mrs. Merton just, you know, she works really in this Frank universe because everything around Frank is so maddening that because she's, you know, very placid, very calm, but still, you know, she's still got the Carolyn Ahern mind there. She's still very, very funny in her own way. That it just works together well. She's very quick. She can keep up with him. But she kind of anchors it. And because she's just an old biddy next to this guy with a papier-mâché head who's spouting off nonsense, then it just makes it all the sweeter. You know, it coheres so wonderfully. So why don't we hear a quick clip of Mrs. Merton's Baby? This is Carolyn Ahern in 1988 on Frank Sidebottom's album.
Hello, Mrs. Merton. I've, got something here for you.
Oh, it's a baby, is it, Frank?
Well, yeah, it's your baby. You remember you said 50p we babysat?
Oh, yes. Oh, I do.
Have you got the money? Because I'm in a hurry, you know. If I leave the baby with you and you check it over later and I'll take the money.
Let's just take a look, Frank.
Oh, yes.
Oh, it looks a bit flatter.
Well, it looks a bit flatter because it actually is a bit flatter because, oh, yeah, that's right. I've had it on a special baby diet, right? It's all the rage now. All the babies are going in for that. Look, dead thin, wafer thin, in fact. That's all the rage.
But our Reginald had such nice hair. Now, what's happened to his hair?
Now, you're probably thinking, that's paint, aren't you? Poster paint.
Well, it looks very like it, Frank.
Well, it is, because that's the fashion. All the babies are doing it. If you watch Top of the Pops this week, Channel 1, top button, you turn it on, and all the babies have got poster paint on.
And now we've heard how Mrs. Merton was heard by others, you know, through Chris Seavey and also through Martin Kellner on the late night BBC radio. But what about how she was seen? You know, because obviously that's such a part of Carolyn in that makeup, in that garb, with that haircut. So again, this is from Mick Middles' book, quote, Carolyn Aherne had been working as the Mitzi Goldberg experience in and around Manchester clubs. John Barrett, then working as studio manager at Pete Waterman's church studio at the wrong end of Deansgate, remembers taking Craig Cash, a long-term friend from their locale, the Bohemian district of Heaton Moor, Stockport, to see Caroline at Fagin's. Craig had already started to work with Caroline at KFM and was keen to get a more well-rounded view of her new friend's talent. Craig and Caroline, locked in their role as co-presenters at KFM, visited John's Heaton Moor home and interviewed John's wife Rosemary. As Ro Newton, she had already built a powerful career in the media, while in London she had gained a position as co-presenter of the Old Grey Whistle Test, while simultaneously presenting a Radio 1 music gossip show, Backchat. As such, and as a Stockport resident, Ro proved perfect for KFM's loose listenership. In recent years, Ro and John have been working on a BSB daytime television show called Cool Cube, and with its roots planted firmly in the Tiswas school of anarchic children's TV with a cult student following, Cool Cube have been chugging away at the idiosyncratic edge of satellite TV for some time. John and Ro invited Caroline to bring Mitzi Goldberg to the show, which she duly did. She also mentioned that she'd gained the role of Mrs. Merton on Frank's Fantastic Shed Show at Piccadilly Radio. As such, a kernel of an idea formed. Mrs. Merton could appear on Cool Cube as a regular agony aunt, a perfect way of encouraging viewer interaction. Caroline duly turned up at the Granada-based studio keen to develop the persona further. Unfortunately, as Mrs. Merton had only been a cartoon character and radio personality up until that point, she arrived with no costume. Unabashed, John and Ro rushed Caroline down to the Coronation Street wardrobe and managed to find a suitable old lady garb, and as such, the visual character of Mrs. Merton was born. I can't find any Cool Cube to play, unfortunately, but however, Frank Sidebottom, his Fantastic Shed Show, was also on TV, was also in those early days, and was also, like Mrs. Merton, a deconstructionalist approach to the chat show, a kind of completely satirical bent, and one like I've never seen before. Like, you know, there's a lot of these out there, Merton, Partridge, Larry Sanders, etc. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. There was one with Rob Brydon, what was that called? But you know, Frank's Fantastic Shed Show, which is all on YouTube, by the way, you can all access it, is one of the wildest things I've ever seen, really. It's like got a full studio audience, you know, it's Frank interviewing people, he's in his shed, which is kind of the ultimate pay-on, really, to like a 60s, 70s childhood and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, it's an exquisite program. And Carolyn Aherne, she's in 3 episodes. She's in the second episode, Crime Watch Timperley Special. Timperley obviously means a lot to Frank Sidebottom. It's where he's from. It's most of his songs seem to centre around it. It's where the statue is of him now, which I still need to make a pilgrimage to. I can't believe there's an actual Frank statue in the UK. Unbelievable. Carolyn's also, as Mrs. Merton, in the 3rd episode, Live Aid 2, and in the 4th episode, Science Fiction. So let's just go through these quickly. So in the Crime Watch episode, she's only in them briefly, but she definitely is a part of the cast and is introduced as such and effectively looks like Mrs. Merton as we know her, but she has a slightly different haircut, but still, you know, she looks elderly, basically. She's got thicker glasses as well, but, you know, she is who she is. And yet, effectively, I guess, in a way, she's kind of Frank's sidekick, but, you know, it is kind of Frank's show, but if there was to be a secondary character in the Fantastic Shed Show series, kind of hard to say, then it definitely is her. So in the 2nd episode, the Crime Watch Special, basically there's this great sequence where there's like a police car that's came through a fence and there's a guy sort of passed out in the front of it. Well, he's somewhat awake and he's got smashed glass there. And it's Mrs. Merton. She's introduced as Frank's neighbour, and the idea is that, you know, you never think crime happens to you. And she's speaking about her lawnmower that was stolen, and they slowly put together this identikit, and obviously what they're putting together is a picture of Frank. You know, he's got the head, he's got the eyes, and he leaps on the bonnet and, you know, grabs that away kind of thing. And it's very typical humour for CV here.
Crime, everyone says, no, it'll never happen to me. Now, Mrs. Merton's here, my next door neighbour, and she has had a crime committed against her. You all right?
A terrible crime
What's
has been
happened?
committed
Well, I was in my garden and I looked around. My lawnmower had been
Lawnmower?
there. The next minute, somebody had made off with it.
Somebody's pinched your lawn.
Thief
Right.
had taken
Well,
it.
let's do an identikit picture here.
I
and
just
see.
got a glimpse of him, very briefly.
Right, well, let's see. Was it like that
No,
yellow
it was
hair?
dark hair.
Oh, dark
and it was
hair,
very
yeah, dark hair
smooth
like
with
that,
a
yeah.
side parting.
Yeah, did he have eyes?
He had big blue eyes.
Big
very
blue eyes,
big.
like that?
No, much bigger and
Oh,
bluer.
bigger than that,
It was
yeah.
just
Eyes
like
that,
that.
yes.
In the second episode, or a second appearance, sorry, it's the third episode of the show, Live Aid 2, which has Midge-Ure of all people in it. She is seen as part of the band early on, laying keyboards down, Carolyn, and they also have a great exchange when she's asking about what you're going to do with all the money that he's raised.
And
What
stuff.
are you going to do with all this money you're raising?
What am I going to do with it? Well, what do you think I'm going to do with it?
I don't know.
Look, I'm raising money here. I'm filling in the squares to send an Eskimo to Disneyland.
But you're going with that Eskimo, though, aren't you?
Of course, because he won't even know anything about Walt Disney. Somebody's got to chaperone him round your old Disney, haven't they?
And the last episode she's in is the fourth episode, Science Fiction, which is a huge Frank preoccupation in general. He's rocking a dashing Thunderbirds costume in this one at the start. I mean, the amount of effort this guy went into to stitch and put together all these things. And Jerry Anderson's in this episode as well. I mean, yeah, some brilliant music as well. Like, they have live music in every episode, and they're kind of great early 90s UK bands. A lot of them are kind of fell by the wayside. But there was one of them that they were playing, and I was like, what is this tune? A band called London Beat, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of or probably most familiar with.
You light up the sky like this heart of mine. You bring on the sun. It's you making it shine. You light up the sky like this heart of mine.
Yeah, doing a bit of research on this, I'd never really heard this song. Kind of reminds me a little bit like the Lighthouse Family, that kind of like, you know, mid-90s, you know, Dave loves those, that kind of uplift kind of thing. But yeah, I've been thinking of you and You Bring on the Sun. Number one hits all around Europe, all around the world. Great tunes. Great that they're included in this as well. Of course, Chris was a very talented musician in his own right. But yeah, in this episode, Mrs. Merton's in it early, next to a rocket dustbin, and I love this clip as well.
But over here, the most spectacular thing in the show is me rocket dustbin. Because, are you all right there, Mrs.
Yes, it's
You
coming up
painted
lovely.
it all wrong. I said checkered. It should be checkered.
Sorry.
Hey, what's all this food for
Well,
here?
I've got you some sandwiches for space there and some pop, because there's no shops in space, you see.
All right. Hey, blue pop, brilliant. Is this fizzy?
No, but if you shake it up and down, it is.
Will it lose its fizz as we go out the atmosphere, you know?
No, I don't think
Well,
so.
I tell you what, I'll drink this myself, because I'm not actually going to space myself.
Little Frank, is he going?
Yes, he is, actually. Because I can't get a helmet big enough.
But how did she get from this to her own show? Well, this is again from Mick Middles' book. Quote, John Barrett also recalls meeting Chris and Caroline in the Horse and Jockey pub in Didsbury. The pair were clearly lost in a conspiratorial huddle before Chris suddenly proclaimed that he was going to manage Caroline and take care of her career. It was a brave notion, although, with the best will in the world, one found it difficult to imagine Chris Seavey having the singular focus necessary to manage a burgeoning television career. Needless to say, the idea never seriously took off. Nevertheless, the Mrs. Merton character was in the ascendancy. An appearance on the legendary Manchester Busker show at Manchester's Green Room was witnessed by a team of Granada producers who included the show as part of their celebratory night out. The audience apparently seemed unusually aged that night, which led to the notion of a Mrs. Merton chat show complete with an audience of pensionable age. Whether that is a simplistic version of events or not is perhaps irrelevant. What did transpire was a complete reversal of fortunes. While Caroline's Mrs. Merton, who undeniably began life as a Chris Seavey invention, see, that's where I don't know if I agree with that, Mick, just from what I've gone through, but, you know, Mick, you're a good writer, I appreciate what you've done. Who undeniably began life as a Chris Seavey invention, gained instant and massive success on Granada television before spreading to cover the country, thereby laying the foundations of a great if troubled career. Chris appeared to fall by the wayside, dragging Frank to perform tirelessly before dwindling audiences. And this is John Barrett speaking again, quote, there was a story going around that Chris had got completely wasted and turned up in the middle of the night in Caroline Ahern's front garden in Burnage. He was shouting that he had made her everything she is. It was a sad part of his life, really. And just before we get into this first episode, this unaired pilot...
Hello, I'm Mrs. Merton, and welcome to Mrs. Merton's Nightcap. This is my new television programme. You may remember me off the wireless, but we're now in a television studio, but I brought some bits from home to make it more homely. So what's it all about? Well, later in the programme, I'm going to be chatting to two people from the world of show business, two DJs, that's disc jockeys, Liz and Andy Kershaw from Radio 1. That's the Popular Parade channel.
This is Merton's Nightcap with the U. Just a little bit more from Mike Keltner from his great article on the Yorkshire Post. Quote, Yorkshire TV had a small studio at the Meadowhall Shopping Centre in Sheffield where we could record a pilot. Dave said, we can get in there when the shopping centre closes. It was almost like we were sneaking in. I got my friend Simon Donald, the editor of Viz magazine, to be one of the guests. Her first question to him was wonderful. What do your parents think of this filthy, dirty magazine? Dave Behrens said she was an absolute natural, and she was. But when I and a friend of mine, who was a producer in London, hawked it around lots of TV stations, they just didn't get it. They said it was too much like Dame Edna Everage, but it wasn't at all. While Dame Edna was this glamorous creation, Mrs. Merton was a lovely little old lady who said the most devastatingly terrible things to people and smiled sweetly throughout. Caroline had a gift for making people laugh, and I still have tapes of the shows we did together with me unable to stop cracking up on air. She had a wicked sense of humour and was so sharp. I remember being at a party years ago where Steve Coogan, with whom she had a friendly rivalry, was telling people he had just auditioned with the Royal Shakespeare Company. She shot back, "The Royal Shakespeare Company? Oh, nobody listens to them anymore." It was so sad to hear of her death. It is such a huge loss. I hadn't seen Caroline for many years, but I worked with a long-time co-writer Craig Cash recently and asked how she was because I knew she had been poorly. He said she was doing fine, so the news came as a real shock to me. Caroline was exactly the same away from the microphone or camera. A genuinely funny, warm person who made everyone laugh. Alright, let's get into Mrs. Merton's Nightcap, which again, fully available on YouTube. Really appreciate someone for uploading that. And you know, the start, it's not the fantastic, uplifting, unforgettable intro, like the actual main show. I mean, we'll get into that in the next episode properly, because obviously it's not on this one, but I just love seeing Merton and the geriatric army march through the cobbled streets. It's, you know, it's really, really great sight. So here we just have kind of an old crooner tune on top of a tired painting of a flower and an old ship. It's classic old Dodder fare, you know. And we fade in, and there's Caroline, Mrs. Merton, sitting amidst cushions, a dolly fro, you know, a cup of tea, an old frilly lamp, and she's looking at us directly, you know. And she has the same hair as in Frank's Fantastic Shed Show. She looks the same, essentially, from, I imagine, when she got that Coronation Street garb on her. She welcomes the audience, says some people might remember her from The Wireless, but, you know, she's brought a few bits from home to make it more homely. And the camera pans out, showing a more distinctly Royal Family type offering in the homestead, as opposed to the Mrs. Merton set, which is kind of the apotheosis of the TV chat show, you know, the long stairwell down into the middle, the audience, all that sort of stuff, the live band, you know, there's none of that here. She mentions her upcoming guests, Liz and Andy Kershaw of the Popular Parade, and, you know, this is a common thing that we're going to encounter throughout this series, that, you know, they love the writers here to anchor her language in the older days, in the elderly, which is really nice, and, you know, it provides so much to us, and crucially, it's something that's very relatable, isn't it? I mean, who hasn't had a nan or a granddad or an experience with these sort of people, you know? Who doesn't sometimes like to lean into those stereotypes, you know? It's just kind of fun, rich pickings, isn't it, for comedy? Mrs. Merton then says she's got the editor of Viz coming on, and she'll also be helping to solve the problems of her viewers. And first on then, as mentioned before, is Chris Donald. I think Martin called him Simon, but it's Chris Donald. And he is the editor of Viz. And what is Viz? Well, Viz is a British adult comic magazine founded in 1979. It parodies British comics of the post-war period, notably The Beano and the Dandy, but with extensive profanity, toilet humour, black comedy, surreal humour, and generally sexual or violent storylines. It also sends up tabloid newspapers with mockeries of articles and letters pages. It features parody competitions and advertisements for overpriced limited edition tat, as well as obsessions with half-forgotten kitsch celebrities from the 60s to the 80s, such as Shaking Stevens and Rodney Bewes. Occasionally it satirises current affairs and politicians, but it has no particular political standpoint. Its success in the early 90s led to the appearance of numerous rivals copying the format Viz pioneered, and none of them managed to attain its popularity. Circulation peaked at 1.2 million in the early 90s, which is when this episode's from, making it the third most popular magazine in the UK. But ABC audited sales have since dropped to an average of 48,000 per issue in 2018, and the 300th issue was published in October 2020. So yeah, here he comes, just sort of comes on. There's no great fanfare, none of Hookie's band just yet. Mrs. Merton, as I mentioned prior as well, calls out the smutty content. And of course, you know, Mrs. Merton, the charm of her, as Carolyn as Mrs. Merton, she's always on. You know, she asks about his wife, she's called Dolores. She doesn't seem to like Viz, though, and Mrs. Merton is quick to say she sounds lovely, asks about his children, comments on how fertile he is for a young man, and he then says that Viz sells about 1 million copies an issue, which, you know, at that time, it's just unbelievable. I had my own run-in with Viz as well. I've always liked comic books, and I remember being a kid, I was literally probably 7 or 8 or something, and we're at some car boot, and they had other comics on there, and I got like a Viz annual, because I used to love like Beano and Dandy, and my parents or whatever must have just not known what it was, or not looked or whatever, and I remember taking it in the car. And I still remember, you know, I was very, very young. I still remember seeing, like, Superman with a giant cock just flying over or something like that, flying over Metropolis. And also this comic about God. It was like a 6-panel comic. And it was just about God, like, flying over Africa, starving, and, you know, tornadoes and waterfalls were happening, and everyone's begging for help, and he's just saying no, and that was it. And, you know, as a young boy that went to Catholic school, that I think that probably had a big effect on me in a way. And a tradition here in the unaired pilot that they kind of did away with in the main show was that guests, you know, were to bring Mrs. Merton something, you know, to put in her home. And something very granny-like as well. And here the Viz editor, he brings a biscuit tin with him, which is classic Nana fare, isn't it? It's been in his family for a long time. His parents had cream crackers out of it, apparently. Mrs. Merton then asks about the mag, and if the parents approve. He mentions how shy he was, and Mrs. Merton then flashes a little bit of a steelier side, you know. Says that he reminds her of someone who eats a lot. You know, he's not skinny, but he's not too large either, but he blames his wife, and, you know, mentions the pub as well, and it's an interesting interview, and from the off, really, Caroline is at ease. She's very funny straight away, you know, she's very captivating. It's a very kind of unique proposition, this is, even back then, and totally now even, you know. I wouldn't say it's been gut-busting yet, but she's confident, she's in control, she's watchable and engaging. She asks if, I guess, like Benny Hill, who, you know, he never watched it as his father only allowed him to watch the BBC. Mrs. Merton says she likes the father, likes the wife. It's only him she doesn't like. But then says it's all a little bit of a joke to confirm. But that is her way. You know, she's allowed to be waspish because she seems a little bit doddery. But, you know, there's an adder underneath the rose, if you will. She also, like Nana does to Anthony when he's going to London, gives a bit of money. She gives a bit more money, though, than Norma did. She gives him £20 via 2 tenors, which is decent, and encourages him to offer a free gift with Viz, as she always has her own attention grabbed by those kind of things, free lipstick or comb in the woman's magazine, etc. Altogether, very entertaining section, and there's a great stinger line at the end here.
When I buy a woman's magazine, if it's got a free lipstick or a comb or something, that grabs my attention, and I tend to buy those kind. So, have you thought about that?
Well, they haven't invented a machine yet that'll stick things to the cover. So, and also it makes it difficult if you've got a pile of magazines in a warehouse.
What about Dolores? Could she not do that?
I suppose I could talk to her about it, but there is a lot of magazines involved. It might take her a while.
You know your other 3 chums, as it were, who help you with it. Do you ever have fights or arguments?
No, very rarely. Well, one of them we have occasionally an argument. It's my brother, but brothers
Your
always
brother?
argue. Yeah.
So both of you and your brother are in it?
That's right, yeah.
I bet your parents are devastated. You'd think you'd have one good child, wouldn't you? Well, Chris, I could go on talking to you for another minute at least, but I've got other important guests waiting to come on. Thank you very much for coming on my programme. You've been lovely.
All right, thanks.
So,
Then into some Vox Pops. Mrs. Merton on location. We go to the body shop, and this is just a great insight, really, visually, into the early 90s commercial sphere, you know. Mrs. Merton spots some old people, heads in, talks to the assistant manager, and interestingly here, we have a recycled joke. And I spotted quite a few of these in the main run of Mrs. Merton, and also the Fast Show, that then crop up on the Royal Family. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, it's Caroline Craig's writing, etc., Henry Normal's writing. But yeah, it's funny because you may remember Norma saying in the first Christmas special about getting something for Anthony from the body shop, and it wasn't tested on animals, and being scared that some of it might fall on the dog. And she says the same here, basically. Mrs. Merton just basically says the same line. The manager laughs, says it's all natural ingredients. We then see Mrs. Merton amongst her fellow geriatrics here in the body shop. There's a mother and daughter. Mrs. Merton asks if the daughter has debris like her mother on the face. And there's a man also. And we see Mrs. Merton, she's just fearless. You know, she asks the man if he washes regularly. She then asks his wife if he were to get slack in that area, what would she do? And quick as a flash, the wife said that she'd bath him as well, which the husband seems down for. We then see a mysterious man. I feel like all of these characters that they meet, I say characters, the public that they meet in the body shop, are real. But then there's this slightly kind of abstruse Frenchman here. that Mrs. Merton kind of engages with briefly, deduces that he's French. It doesn't quite land for me there. And she then talks to some young girls, 14 years old, they say. She says she might need to tell their mothers that they're buying lip balm. And we see their reactions. They're just a bit confused. They don't really know how to take it. So, I do assume these were real. It's a shame they don't do more of these Mrs. Merton on location type things, but in the main show, the focus is more on the kind of big celebrity guests, the audience, and then also the big debates that they have as well. But yeah, it is a shame because Mrs. Merton is really good on her feet with the public. Not quite Frank level, but that's a different archetype, We then get into a letters section, which is of course what she'd done prior on the BBC, this kind of the agony aunt idea. We even see on camera, she's reading off these letters and we see they're handwritten as she reads them out. It's a really nice touch. There's one problem that speaks about someone gets in touch talking about how their son is with a new girlfriend who's a vegetarian and oh my god, what do you do? Kind of reminiscent of Emma as well, visiting with Anthony's birthday. And Carolyn Ahern, I keep calling her Carolyn Ahern, Mrs. Merton, she mentions that you can just get a chicken from the butchers that died of natural causes. And you can have the butcher to sign it off like a doctor's note to prove it. I mean, I love it. It's just really absurd, but really tight. And they move on again. Again, love seeing the handwriting here. And someone gets in touch from London talking about how their dentures don't fit in their mouth. And Mrs. Merton just says it's okay. It's worth reflecting on those that have been successful, that have made it in show business, that have awful teeth. Like Esther Ranson, Cilla Black or Bugs Bunny.
Dear Mrs. Merton, just recently I found myself visiting the dentist only to come out without any teeth at all and a pair of dentures. But Mrs. Merton, they don't fit properly. What can I do? Please help me. Awful teeth don't have to be a problem. We need only look at people in the show business world who have made it with awful teeth. People like Cilla Black or Esther Ranson or Bugs Bunny. People like that. So that's your problem solved.
Okay, and the final section is Mrs. Merton inviting two big celebrities of the time, Liz and Andy Kershaw. So who are these? Well, Liz Kershaw is an English radio broadcaster. She is the second longest serving female national radio DJ in the UK after Annie Nightingale, celebrating 30 years on national BBC radio in 2017. Andy Kershaw is a broadcaster and disc jockey, predominantly on radio and known for his interest in world music. Kershaw's shows feature a mix of country, blues, reggae, folk music, African music, spoken word performances, and a wide variety of other music from around the world. He's an interesting nut, Andy Kershaw, as well, so I really like Mark Ellen and David Hepworth. And I was reading Mark Ellen's book, Rock Stars Ruin My Life. And, Kershaw was part of the old grey whistle test, like Mark Ellen and Hepworth were as well. And he seems a little bit of a sourpuss, he doesn't want to do things any other way. But he seems quite generous on this show, interestingly. And he does have a bit of a fraught personal life. It's interesting that I keep calling her Carolyn, Mrs. Merton, makes reference to him getting married. And, makes for some pretty grim reading if you explore that a bit further. But hey, talking about this episode now, and she talks about how, first of all, Mrs. Merton, how neither of them have very nice voices. Like, how did you get on radio kind of thing, They talk about some of the DJs at the time, Steve Wright, Bruno Brooks, and they crack up. She really has a way of disarming people. We see that quite a lot in the main Mrs. Merton show. Look, majority of the time, people find it funny. People know they're being ribbed here. Some people can take it a bit more seriously, and some people clearly don't really know what's going on, or don't really care to know, or just can't even entertain the prospect of their ego maybe being pushed in a certain direction. But yeah, they mention an advert they were part of, Radio on road shows. In terms of the gifts, Andy brings a Peter Rabbit, a knobbly one that he's had for 31 years. And Liz Kershaw brings a signed picture of Billy Tarmy and Liz Dawn, who played the legendary Jack and Vera on Coronation Street, which, again, some more northern icons here. Merton asks about their parents. They seem nonplussed. Andy calls his father a snob, and Mrs. Merton said she's surprised, and the two of them seem like they haven't came from much stock. She asks blankly how much money they earn. They say they earn a lot and spend a lot. And he mentions drugs. Mrs. Merton is quick to poo-poo that. And the two then there was a test that was teased earlier with the Viz guy just in the intro about butter and margarine, and Mrs. Merton saying that she feels like, the older generation can tell, but the younger generation can't. I mean, it's quite an inane little thing that doesn't really translate to TV that well. But still, it's funny for a time, and obviously Mrs. Merton gets mixed up like the rest of them do as well. And she then concludes, it's quite a brief interview, but she then concludes asking people to write into her at Yorkshire TV. The lights dim, the conversation continues off mic, and it's a great pilot, to be honest with you. She is terrific in this. It's a very different show, the Mrs. Merton show, than from the Nightcap. I mean, this has, a much more kind of somnambulant kind of idea to it. But still, it's sensational, and I can't wait to get onto the main series proper. So that concludes this proper rambling history of Carolyn Ahern and Mrs. Merton and, you know, Frank Sidebottom and how it all came together and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, guys, and there you have it. There are my thoughts on the unaired pilot, on Carolyn's rise to fame, you know, with Chris Seavey and Martin Kellner and all that. It's still kind of early days, really, in that chronology, but still, this has been the first episode of Mrs. Merton Blurting, and I just want to finally say, if you want to come on the show, if you want to tackle an episode of the Mrs. Merton Show, it's the royalramblepod@gmail.com, the Royal Ramble Pod. Email me there. We'll agree what episodes you can do. We'll agree a date, and then we'll get to it, basically. Also, the Patreon is there as well, so if you want to leave a 5-star review on iTunes and you want to send me proof of that via email, I'll put you in a draw, and maybe you'll get access to the Grapes tapes. Or if you want instant access to the Grapes tapes, which is my deep dive into the classic sitcom Early Doors, written by Craig Cash and Phil Mealy, then go support over on Patreon. You not only get access to the first 5 episodes of the Grapes tapes, but also long-form thoughts on Hard Labour and Dead Man's Shoes and various other things that go on the Patreon as well. So there's plenty there to listen to. So yeah, this has been Tom Quee. Appreciate you joining me for this inaugural edition of Mrs. Merton Blurton. We'll be back next month to tackle the pilot proper. You know, the one with Chris Akabusi, Debbie McGee, Chris Greener, and Steve Coogan. It is a fantastic start to an incredible series. But yeah, until then, this has been your host, Tom Quee. Speak soon. Bye.
Tom Quee presents The Royal Ramble, an episode-by-episode celebration of the classic British sitcom, The Royal Family. To get in touch with the show, email us at theroyalramblepod@gmail.com.